What's up, everybody? Hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to episode 21. My name is Dwyan, and today we are going to be looking at a video that I found recently by Candace Owens talking about a short history or a brief history of slavery. Very interesting video. It got a lot of views, and I just had to respond to it. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's get to it. Who is Candace Owens? Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of her already, but just in case those of you have not heard of her, let me just introduce her real quickly and before we get into the video. So, in August of 2017, this is really the date when Candace Owens emerges. I updated my first political video onto YouTube. Again, this is coming from her own words on her website. Given a million chances, I would have never guessed that it would have led me to this point. Perhaps that's one of life's secrets. Don't dream, just keep going. Now, Candace Amber Owens Farmer is an American conservative political commentator, author, activist, and television presenter. So she gained prominence for her conservative views and outspoken commentary on various political and social issues. Candace on Race in America, she believes white supremacy, racism, and nationalism are not a problem in America today. Not a problem in America today. She goes on to say if she had a list of 100 things plaguing America, it wouldn't even make the list. Wow. That's all I say. Wow. The top 2 things concerning Black America are fathers not in the home, and education and literacy. Okay? What else does Candace say about race in America? She has a bestseller called Blackout. Came out a few years back. How Black America Can Make Its Second Escape from the Democratic Plantation. She sees a rise in Black conservatism today, and I think that's true, because Black Americans are finally starting to wake up and realize that the Democratic Party doesn't support them, us, and that their policies have been really detrimental to our communities. She would never support reparations. Okay, as you guys know, if you've been watching my channel, I support reparations for Black Americans 100%. So this is going to be interesting. She would never support reparation. She does not think it can happen, and it makes no sense to give cash to Black America who were never slaves. She married George Farmer. They married in 2019. 3 children. He's a theology graduate of Oxford University, Catholic, interesting, a vocal conservative and opposes the European Union. He changed his political allegiance to the Brexit Party due to his anti-EU feelings. So that's Candace Owens. She's 34 years old. She was born in 1989. So she's relatively young. And as I said, she's a political commentator. She's pretty well known in the United States, and I think even internationally. So she has a YouTube channel, Candace Owens Podcast, as you can see there. She's got 3 million subscribers. This just gives you a little breakdown. This is a plug for you, Candace, you see? Yeah. And as you can see, I mean, she gets a lot of views. I mean, she gets millions of views pretty much per everything that she releases. She's very popular on YouTube, big YouTube influencer, big American political conservative commentator. Now, the video that I am going to react to today is this video here that was done, I guess, through Prager University or by Prager University or PragerU, I assume that's university. And as you can see there, a short history on slavery. They also give their facts and sources, which is good. I definitely commend them for that. And I encourage people to go and check out their facts and sources. And as you can see on YouTube, the video here at 2.5 million views. It came out a couple of years ago, back in August of 2021. So it's been a while. I'm kind of late to the party here because I've been I just found it quite recently, and I heard it, and I was just like, whoa, I've got to do a response to this, and that's what we're going to do today. So let's get right into it.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion,
Okay, let's stop that there and go back a little bit. And let's start again.
it was not invented by white people of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then.
Okay,
It did
so she
not start
says the first big point here is that slavery was not
invented by white people.
So slavery was not invented by white people. So this is very interesting. You know, the definition that she's using here for slavery, I think it's wrong to just assume we know what she's talking about. And that's my first point of contention here that I want to bring up, is that I think that there needs to be a definition of slavery, because as you will see, and as I will present, that there have been different forms of history and there have been different forms of slavery, and in history they are quite different from each other and quite distinct from each other. So my thing here is to really give a bit more context and meat to this presentation so that people can really understand, what's going on here, and really look at this. Slavery was not invented by white people. The other thing also is that, what's white people?
What you had was the invention of this, or the first appearance of this human category called white people in this amendment. The amendment occurred in 1681, but the original law that it was amending arose in 1664. And it sought to punish British and other freeborn women who married enslaved Negro men. So in 1681, you have an amendment to this first law that punished women who entered into these marriages. But in the law of 1681, rather than the law using the language of British and other freeborn women, the language is British and other white women. So this reflects the first appearance of this human category called white people in law, that asserted this brand new category of humanity called white people, and continued to give it definite boundaries and definition, ultimately inserting the meaning that white is superior to those excluded from it.
Now, on the surface of this, I would say this is a true statement because, number one, as you just heard, white people were only really invented in the New World. This group collective of people called white people. So slavery did exist before it came to the New World. So yes, slavery was not invented by white people. Okay, so Dwyan, so what's your whole thing? So why what's your reaction to this? So she's right. Slavery was not invented by white people. My first thing is this. So what? So what if it was not invented by white people? Are we trying to say that, hey, white people are the ones that brought slavery, and now you're coming to say slavery was not invented by white people? Well, okay, I don't think anybody is disputing that. But what I think is very important is to really define slavery and put slavery in its context. And then I think once we do that, we can really see what exactly white people did invent. Okay, so let's tackle that right now, right? Okay, so slavery. Slavery is the ownership of a person as property, especially in regards to their labor. Slavery typically involves compulsory work, with the slave's location of work and residence dictated by the party that holds them in bondage. Okay. Now, what I would say is that that is a very general term, definition of slavery. And if Candace is using this definition, then okay, yes, slavery was not invented by white people. But then again, so what? Who cares who invented slavery or not? Are black people or non-white people saying that white people invented slavery? I don't hear that, you know. But again, it's based on the definition of slavery. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's put slavery in its proper context, right? So let's look at the 13th Amendment, right? Which is the document or the law that was put into place in the United States of America in order to abolish slavery. Let's read what it says there. Section 1, Amendment 13, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, interesting, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay, so here we have neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. What's involuntary servitude, right? So the Constitution didn't just say slavery, it also added this thing called involuntary servitude. Okay, so what is slavery? What is involuntary servitude? What is the context in which we need to look at this? Well, they are labor systems. They are a type of labor systems. There's two types. You have the involuntary and the voluntary labor systems, right? Now let's look at voluntary. Most of us will be pretty much familiar with voluntary labor systems, right? We have one there on the top there, indentured servitude. We'll come back to that. We have the employment contract. Most people are fully aware of that. It's a modern form of labor agreement where individuals agree to provide their services under defined conditions in exchange for payment or remuneration, right? And this obviously encompasses a very wide range of occupations and industries. You have apprenticeship, right, which is usually for the younger members of a society to learn a trade from a skilled employer rather, right? And they also agree to work for a certain period of time, and it's usually for slightly lower wages or no wages at all, right? The point there is just to get the experience. So I think most of us are familiar with that. But then there's something called indentured servitude. So indentured servitude is where individuals agree to work for a specific period in exchange for transport, accommodation a lot of times, and just basic sustenance, okay? It was very common in the 17th and 18th century, but also in the 19th and in the early 20th century as well. In America, for example, many of the Europeans who came here in the 18th century, in particular, a lot of them came through this indentured servitude system, right? I think about Russians, I think about the Chinese, I think about the Japanese, I think about the Irish, I think about the Italians, right? A lot of these groups, the early immigrants, came through this system of indentured servitude. But as we saw, if we just flip back here to the 13th Amendment, what is being abolished is involuntary servitude, right? And I've just stated here that indentured servitude is voluntary. You choose to do it. Nobody's forcing you to do it, right? So it was a very common type of labor system. And in many respects, it still exists even today in many parts of the world, right? It's kind of like this age-old system that's always been around. Then on the other side, we have involuntary, right? What are involuntary? Well, obviously slavery. And I separate slavery from these other four forms of involuntary labor systems. You have debt bondage, for example, right? And here the individuals pledge themselves against the loan, for example, right? Usually the labor is not necessarily defined, but debt bondage is very, very brutal because a lot of times it was very difficult for people to get out of this debt and therefore they remain bondage. And many people, not just blacks, but many others suffered under this type of labor system. You then have forced labor. I didn't put forced labor here because really all of these are kind of forced labor, but there is a forced labor that doesn't mean that you're a slave or that you're in debt, but there is a type of forced labor where people are coerced into working against their will for the state. And I think at the bottom one there, convict leasing can also fit that category, right? This is where, if you are convicted of a crime and you are in prison, your labor as a prisoner can be leased to private corporations and other entities, right? As a condition of that um, uh, conviction, right? And this is being forced to work against your will. We then have serfdom, as you see number 3 down there. And serfdom is really something not necessarily totally from the past, but, we look at medieval Europe, for example, where serfs were tied to the land, right? Also known as feudal systems, right? They were not owned, so this is what separates them from slavery, from slaves, but they couldn't, they still had a lot of restrictions on their freedom. So, for example, they couldn't leave the land without the landlord's permission, for example, right? And again, just like some of the other forms of involuntary servitude, you also have some, usually in exchange, providing labor in exchange for protection or even the right to actually work a piece of land, right? So that's been a traditional system in the past. Of course, also prisoner of war, right? You've also had that. That kind of speaks for itself. I'm not going to go too deep into that. So what I've tried to do here is to put what we saw in the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, okay? I'm putting it into the context. So you can see that involuntary servitude, the items on the left, including slavery, were pretty much outlawed, right? And in fact, the truth of the matter is, even after the Civil War in the United States of America, there was forms of convict leasing after the Civil War. Okay, in other words, people who were convicted of a crime, okay, regardless of whether that crime was something that even warrant being branded a criminal. And we saw that particularly with Black Americans, there was a lot of convict leasing that was going on, right? But it is an involuntary labor system. Okay, some people might say it's voluntary because, hey, no one told you to commit the crime and you're in jail now, so you got to go work. So some people might use that sort of logic to say that it is voluntary, but really it's involuntary, right? And particularly in the United States of America, like I said. So I want to put this in context, slavery. Now, you notice with slavery up there, there's the word chattel next to it. And I think that's very important, right? Because remember, in our definition of slavery, slavery involves the ownership of a person as property, okay? And I want you to understand that chattel slavery, in addition to the owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other systems of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor, also considered to be slavery. So in other words, a lot of these items are also considered to be slavery, even though, as I told you, that you can separate them, because in the items on the left there, in the involuntary items, the debt, bondage, or serfdom, the prisoner of war, convict leasing, the person was not owned. The human being was not owned. The ownership is really what separates one from slavery. So what I argue is that in the New World slavery, racism, white supremacy, the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages. Furthermore, the enslaved were in fact considered and treated as an inferior race with no citizen or human rights. So this is very important, right? We have to understand that this is what makes, and I call it at the top there, as you can see, New World slavery, because this is what makes it distinctive from other forms of slavery that happen in other parts of the world at different times in history. This, I call it, as you see, New World Slavery, but really what I'm saying is it's really the character of this New World Slavery is based on white supremacy, racism, right? Where the enslaved were not only owned as property, and by the way, their children. This is the perpetual slavery. Their children were also considered to be slaves. In the old world, in other areas where you had slavery, the children of slaves were not necessarily considered slaves as well. And this is another distinction in the New World slavery, right? And then, of course, there highlighted in the bottom is this issue of racism, white supremacy, where one group of people are treated as an inferior race with no citizen or human rights. This is what makes it distinct. Okay, now let's go further. I know I haven't really gone deep into her video, but I think it's important for us to understand what slavery is and put it into its context and look at the different forms of slavery so that we can really understand, did the white people invent slavery? My argument obviously is that they definitely invented this white supremacy, racism, which was the character of the or the goal or the underlying reason or justification for the enslavement of Black people in the New World. This is very important. And that was invented by white people, right? So let's be clear on that. Okay. White supremacy was invented by white people, more specifically, the white elites or the white landlords, or however you want to call them. Now, let's look at the comparison. Let's look at the indigenous African slavery. Now, I still wouldn't call it slavery in the African sense, but in order to have the consistency and the fairness, let's look at indigenous African slavery. Let's look at Arab slave trade, which was the slave trade that occurred in North and West Africa long before the Europeans, and the Atlantic slave trade, which is the third one. What are its roots and origins? Well, in the indigenous sense, it's rooted in local, tribal, and societal customs. To understand that more, let's look at the Arab slave trade, influenced by Islamic conquest and trade. Then in the European slave trade, it was driven by European racism, white supremacy, and colonialism. Okay, so very, very different for all three, very different roots. You have very, very different origins. And these roots and origins actually steer the nature of the type of slavery that manifests from that. I hope that's clear to people. That's why it's very important to define slavery and understand the different types of slavery, because they are vastly different from each other. What else? The primary use of slaves. In the African indigenous, quote unquote, slavery, domestic labor. This was the primary use of slaves, agricultural work, and there was some societal integration. In the Arab slave trade, you had more of the slaves playing the role of concubines, the women. The men went into soldiering, and by the way, a lot of them were castrated, as we know, right? Because obviously, you've conquered a people, you want to dominate them. You don't want them to reproduce so that you can then reproduce with their women. And that's what really happened for much of the Arab slave trade, right? Didn't happen all over, even in the different parts of Africa that the Arabs conquered, and it took them hundreds of years. There was differences, absolutely, but generally speaking, this is what it looked like. And of course, some domestic labor and agriculture. In the European slave trade, it was for plantation labor in the New World colonies, mass production of goods. And this is very, very key and very, very important to understand. What else do we have? The duration of the slavery, right? In the African context, it was a debt you paid off, and then that was it. You were no longer in servitude. And again, I would say in the African context, it's really servitude rather than slavery. There's a difference because remember, even the Constitution says there's a difference between servitude and slavery, right? Remember, it's right there in the Constitution. So, indigenous African slavery, debt, crime, warfare, the Arab slave trade, some could buy their freedom, and really very few could buy their freedom. And certainly, if you were willing to convert to Islam, that was a way also to get your freedom because, you know, Muslims cannot enslave each other, right? Uh, that's forbidden. So one way that people did was to convert to Islam, right? But again, remember, this was like sticking a gun to someone's head and saying, "Hey, either convert or die." You know, so you can imagine that a lot of people did try to convert, but even still, then it was still tough conditions because they were still a conquered people, right? And then, as you can see there, that many were enslaved for their entire lives. In the European slave trade, it was typically for life. It was generational, and the status was inherited. This is very key, and this is something that makes the New World slavery very, very, very different from the slaveries that happened in the past. That's why it's important, and that's why I'm doing this, to show you the different types of slavery, to understand really what did white people actually invent. So treatment and rights, right? The slave had rights in the indigenous African setting. The slave has rights. They could even own property, which means that they were not considered property because property can't own property. And they were able to integrate into society. You can even see, like in biblical stories, gosh, can I think of one? Yes, you think of Joseph, right? Joseph had his 11 brothers and Joseph, remember? Now, Joseph was not born a slave, right? So that's key in telling you that it wasn't generational. But his brothers sold him into slavery, remember? They were kind of jealous of him. They sold him into slavery. He went into a foreign land and he became a slave. But what happened? As he got older, because he had certain gifts, like what was his big gift? He was able to interpret dreams, remember? And Joseph actually rose to be, I think, number 2 or number 3 in Egypt. I think he was the governor, right? So that just shows you that, you know, even though you were a slave, it was not generational because Joseph was not born a slave, right? In this example, it was not generational. This is what makes it very, very distinct in the context of the New World slavery, you know, guided by white supremacy / racism. Okay, so in the Arab, some rights, and like I said, you know, if you were willing to convert to Islam, those were the ones who were treated a little bit better and considered, you know, people, right? And were granted rights. But most had no rights. No rights. In the European context, no rights, owned, bought and sold, and it was dehumanizing. It was dehumanizing in the Arab slave trade too, don't get me wrong. And very brutal conditions. And it was brutal in the Arab slave trade as well. But you cannot apply that, in my estimation, to the indigenous African slavery or the indigenous African servitude. So let's look at this again. The enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages. Furthermore, the enslaved were in fact considered and treated as an inferior race with no citizen or human rights. So, Candace says, or PragerU says, slavery was not invented by white people. Here's my response. Still, it is undeniable that the white ruling elites of Europe played the implementer role in shaping and perpetuating the most expansive and brutal form of chattel slavery in history, starting with the transatlantic slave trade. I think that's more the 1600s rather than 1400s. 1400s was really when the Europeans first started to really make contact with Africa and travel around the coast, like the Portuguese and the Spanish. So really, that should have been 1600. So, and I call this slavery 2.0, and that was invented by white people. The white elites, the white ruling elites, to be more specific. But we just say white people just because it's easier. Obviously, every white person did not do that. So it was invented by the white ruling elites of Europe. They invented this form of chattel slavery that existed throughout the Americas. Okay.
It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas.
Okay, so I hope now, based on what I've done, you can see when she starts to say slavery didn't start so and so well, the chattel slavery and the form that it took in the New World, so-called New World, right? That started in the New World. And that was a very different, distinct, unique form of slavery that has never been seen, as far as anyone can tell, in the history of the world. Since we started recording history, this was unique and different. And why? Let's recap. For these reasons, it was generational. Perpetual slavery. Your children and their children, etc., became slaves. In the United States of America in particular, you know that Black Americans went through 12 generations of perpetual slavery. 12 over 250 years. That is unique. And also, when you float in the issue of white supremacy and racism as the nature and character of that slavery, where Black people are not just enslaved and owned and treated as property, but they are considered inferior. And this is an absolutely critical element of this whole thing.
Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
So this, again, when I hear this piece, I'm like, you see, it's almost like this piece that Candace is doing is trying to sort of make white people seem as if, come on, they didn't do anything that bad, and certainly everybody else was doing it. This idea, and then you see she says that Christopher Columbus came and this particular tribe hoped that they would come and help. This white savior mentality, that only white people can save the world. And you see it right here in this thing. Now you're talking about one tribe in America hoping, oh, the white savior, come and help these people because they're eating us. I think it's far more complicated than that. If these people were engaged in cannibalism, there's a bigger story there, because she even said sometimes they would serve them up for dinner. So even she's acknowledging that it wasn't like this all the time. So, we don't know what they were fighting about. We don't know what the issues were. We don't understand the entire thing. It's just, to me, this comes across as propaganda.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of East.
Okay, I already did the comparison to show you the different types of slavery, the European slavery, the Arab, and then the African one. And you can see clearly that they're very, very different. There's nothing you can tell me that these things are all the same. Yet she continues to use the word slavery across all time and across all people.
Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks.
Okay, that's not Africans. Okay, and then again, this is another thing that, white people were also enslaved. Okay, and look, I don't approve anybody enslaving, dominating, forcing people to work against their wills, no matter where it happens. Absolutely. But my question is, why, Candace, do you have to do this? Why do you have to defend these people, defend white people by saying something like, "Oh, white people are also enslaved"? So, so what? It does, how does that take away from the enslavement of black people in this country and in the New World? How does that? What does that matter? You understand what I'm saying? Because it almost sounds as if she's saying, "Hey, listen, black people, don't get too into this slavery thing and all this. You weren't the only ones that got enslaved. White people were enslaved too. Take it easy. Don't make a big deal about this. This is how this is the undertone of this. And I think this is disgraceful for a black woman to sit there and use these points as a defense of the slavery that was done to black people in the New World. Is absolutely, in my opinion, it is 100% disgraceful.
Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries.
So what?
Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC.
So what?
It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave
Aristotle
master model
considered
was
it
just
natural.
how the world
You know what also Aristotle said and believed? He believed that women were naturally inferior to men and that men should rule women. So check that out, Candace.
operated in the great philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery.
And again, guys, you see, this sounds like it's logical, but you have to define slavery and put slavery in its context. You can't use that word across all space of time. This is really the point that I'm trying to make here, like we have to look at the nuance. We have to look at the differences because that helps to make us understand really what's going on. And I hope, you guys are getting that.
As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved. Here's the second.
So what? A third of the ancient population was enslaved. There was a slavery 5,000 years ago in Egypt. The white people were enslaved. So what? Are you saying that, hey, black people, get over it? Other people were enslaved too. You're not the only ones. That doesn't, is that the argument? Because here's my thing. Like, let's imagine we were in a court of law, ladies and gentlemen, and I was suing the American government, right? So I am suing the government for the whole issue of slavery. And then the government, who are now the defense, they start to say, oh, but wait a minute. Slavery happened in Africa 500,000 years ago. Slavery happened in Persia. The white people were enslaved. If this was an argument that was being used in the court of law against me suing the American government for enslaving black Americans, that is irrelevant. It's irrelevant whether other people were doing it in history or not. We are in court to address the specific needs of black Americans and what they went through. You have to, the court of law, the victim's suffering and the victim's perspective has to be the focus. It can't be like, oh, you guys had it, everybody's been enslaved. What's the problem? That is not a logical argument when in a court of law. You can't do that. And I hope you guys understand what I'm saying.
Second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly
Okay, white people were the first to put an end to slavery. Let's hear
followed by
this.
France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice.
Now, this this again is another very, very horrible thing to say in this, okay? Because first of all, white people were not the first to formally put an end to slavery. Now, here in the New World, right, the Americas, right, Haiti was the first Western world, New World country to put an end to slavery in 1804. Okay, that was just a hiccup that came in the camera there. I hope that didn't anything. Haiti was the first country to put an end to slavery in 1804. That's 29 years before this 1833 Slavery Abolition Act that you just mentioned. Okay, so that's when Haiti defeated the French. Okay, and no more slavery. Right? That doesn't sound like white people were the first to put an end to slavery. Right? Black people were the first to put an end to slavery. And the thing is, this negates all the resistance that Black people and other people around the world were engaged in to thwart this colonialism and racism and white supremacy that was overtaking the globe during this period. Okay, so Haiti was the first. And I'll give you another country, Mexico in 1829, which is before this 1833, was another country that abolished slavery, got it totally abolished. Some people will say it happened even earlier, 1821, when Mexico got its independence. But 1829 officially still below this. So what this shows is that by the time white people got around to organizing themselves, the abolition movement and everything like that was created because there was resistance to it and people were fighting against it. And I'm telling you, Haiti defeating the French was a big blow to the whole institution of slavery in the Western world, and really was the catalyst, I would say, that sparked all the momentum for the abolitionist movement that happened. And that was not white people who were the first to formally put an end to slavery. That is a bold-faced lie. And again, this is a propaganda video, right?
I mean, it's a nonsense narrative that was spun that we ran with because we had not done our own research. Well, what became interesting was that when abolition came, and the book explains the real reasons for abolition, that it wasn't a change of hearts, it was a change of thinking. And it was a change of thinking forced upon the slavers by the Africans who had revolted, in particular in Haiti. It was the Haitian Revolution that now made it clear that they can't sustain the trade any longer. And that's when they started thinking of abolition. And in the course of the abolition debates, because they didn't, those who were profiting from the system, because any political system has winners and losers, those who were profiting from the system weren't going to roll over and say, you take my daily bread away. They were resisting, they were holding on. And so the arguments in Parliament were actually very revealing. One side arguing that it's evil, it's got to go, etc. The other one says, no, we need it, it must continue, etc. And in the course of those exchanges, evidence spills out as to how the trade was really being instigated. And I remember one of the prime ministers who said that it is we who are instigating the trade. It is we who have the demand. It is we who supply the weapons for them to go and fight other groups and capture them, and in order to supply our needs.
At this point, I want to say this. I've been wondering, right? Did Candace write this and then go to PragerU and said, hey, listen, I got a little short video on thing here. Would you guys mind filming it for me, right? Or did PragerU write this and then went and got Candace to come and say it? I have a feeling it's that. Now, it could be both. Maybe they both thought of the idea together and they both wrote it together. But either way, this, if Candace wrote this herself and went to Prager University, then Candace has a problem, okay? She still has a problem if they wrote it, and gave it to her to say it. Because imagine a white person saying some of this stuff. This stuff she says later that is worse than this.
1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by...
Now, she cleverly said the first country in the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. You see, that's a play on words. Maybe they were the first country to do a Slavery Abolition Act, right? Maybe Mexico or Haiti called it a different name. You know what I mean? So now she's the first to do it. But some of you will say, yeah, well, she's talking about the Slavery Abolition Act. Well, it doesn't go... where is it? Here's the headline. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. They didn't say white people were the first to create a Slavery Abolition Act. This is the headline right here, what we're seeing on the screen. White people were the first. They were not. And the thing is, this undermines, in my opinion, this undermines all the, how can I put it? All the resistance and all the non-white people who were fighting and pushing to get this happen. You know, it's like saying white people were the first to introduce in America to introduce a civil rights bill. Come on, man. First of all, it's only them who can introduce it because they dominate the whole Congress anyway. So it has to be them who's the first to come up with a civil rights bill. But they didn't come up with it out of the goodness of their heart. They came out of it because of the resistance and the pressure that was being put by non-white people on the system. And it's the same with this. They did not just come out of the goodness of their hearts and say, oh, wake up one day and say, you know, we got to end this thing called slavery. No. Now, she also mentions that, oh, yes, and look at the more good and wonderful white people who abolished slavery in the United States of America with the 13th Amendment. Look at the 13th Amendment, ladies and gentlemen. It's right up there on the screen. I want you to read this and understand. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except, right? Except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. In other words, if you're a criminal, you could be enslaved. You could undergo involuntary servitude if you were a criminal, meaning that you were convicted of a crime. This was the big compromise, in my opinion, the 13th Amendment between the North and the South. This exception clause, because what this did is that right after this, something called the Black Codes were introduced in the South, in many of the southern states, right? The slave states. And what the Black Codes is a way of criminalizing Black people. Why would they want to criminalize Black people? Well, it's right here. Because if we criminalize them, then we can use them as slaves. And that's and that's exactly what happened after 1865. You have a lot of the Black conservatives who, you know, look at 1865 to 1960 and look at, oh, this is a glorious 100 years for Black people. Our marriage rates were so high and we were doing so well. No, it was not. It was a horrible time for Black people in this country. Horrible, okay? Particularly after the Reconstruction period, which was roughly 1877 with the so-called Missouri Compromise, which was another compromise between the North and the South to do what? To keep Black people in their place and keep them enslaved, in my opinion.
Of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers over...
White men led the world. I mean, they were the ones who were implementing the goddamn slavery. Who else was gonna abolish it? What, the non-white people who were the victims of it? Of course, they had to be the ones to do it formally in their constitutions and all that type of stuff. But they didn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because of the pressure. Okay, I mean, it would have been obvious to anybody that this institution was terribly wrong and degrading, even to young white people, the new generation of whites who were being born and coming up and seeing this. It would be clear to everyone that this was an abhorrent practice.
Overwhelmingly white who died during the Civil War. Now,
These soldiers who died during the Civil War, you know, I'm one of those people that I don't believe that the Civil War was fought strictly on the whole issue of slavery. I know that the white dominant society would like us to believe that it was, and this is something that Candace is repeating here. I mean, we got to remember a couple of things that I think ultimately wars are fought over the issue of power. And we got to remember that when Abraham Lincoln, so the Civil War started roughly in 1862, 63. So Abraham Lincoln became president in 1860. And remember, at the time that he became president, you had a few states that had already threatened or even seceded from the Union. So the Union was being broken apart. Now, people will say, yes, it was being broken apart because of slavery. Well, not entirely, because it was being broken apart because when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, he was a third-party candidate, and he was able to win the presidency without a single Southern constituency. In other words, the South didn't vote for Lincoln. Okay? Yet he became president. So there was this breaking up of the Union because of that. And that has to be factored into understanding the Civil War. And there's other factors as well, but this is not something about
saying
the
that
Civil
this
War.
makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated.
I'll tell you that, Candace. Human history is complicated. You're doing a 5-minute video on the history of slavery, and then you turn around and say that history is complicated. I'm here to tell the truth. This is not the truth. This is propaganda and lies.
No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless.
Now, no one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Well, you know, we're talking, at least I am, when we're talking, because Candace is American, and she grew up in America, and we're talking about America. I can't speak for everyone else in the world, but in America, this statement is not true. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. I think it's very clear in America who is guilty and who is not guilty, right? Because she's not denying that slavery did not exist, you know. So I'm sorry, you know.
Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few.
So what? So what? Ladies and gentlemen, man, I want to show you guys something, man. You know, again, she's saying that we are so focused on what white people did. What about what all these other people did? Again, that is a nonsense. It's historically irrelevant. It doesn't matter that other people did it so and so. It doesn't exonerate you from what you did because other people have done it in the past. It's a weak argument. This whole thing. And I mean, you started off by saying slavery was not invented by white people. First of all, who the fuck cares who the fuck invented it? We're about restitution and reparations for the people who enslaved Black Americans and other blacks throughout the New World. Then she's saying that whites were the first. No, they weren't. I've told you, Haiti was the first, and they fought for it, by the way. You know, so this business of
Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon.
I've answered this question. The New World slavery is a white phenomenon, right? The slavery in America, in the Americas, is a white phenomenon. If you want to use the term white phenomenon in that sense, it is. Okay, and she's making it seem like, oh no, it's not a white phenomenon because other people were doing it before white people. And even if that's the case, so what? So what?
And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social
This is please, in the new world, the type of slavery that existed, as I told you before, something called, the nature and character of it was called white supremacy. Okay, I'm going to say it again and again and again, my fellow people. The nature of it was white supremacy, and that is a white phenomenon.
media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other Black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their Black partners to bring them Black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
Can you believe a Black woman saying that? Our lives had very little value to our ancestors. This is so disgraceful. I mean, when I heard this, I was like, I don't. Did she write this, or did PragerU write this for her, or someone else write it for her to say this, and then she agreed to say it? Like, this is so disgusting. Okay, now let's break down some of the points that she just made there. Right? She talked about this whole issue of Blacks were sold by other Black Africans. Your own people sold you. They sold you for practically nothing. You know, I mean, if this was not Candace Owens and this was a white person saying this, there would be an outcry. If a white person says, your own people sold you, they sold you for nothing, just little rum or something like that, and your lives had very little value, there would be an uproar. People would be like, yo, what the hell's going on? But once you get this black face saying it, it's just, and I think honestly, I'll be very surprised if Candace wrote this and then went to Prager. I think it was the other way around. You know, I'm willing to bet on it. You know, that she did not write this, or certainly did not write all of this, but she was used. Blackface. Come on, you say this. You know, you say this. This video has 2.5 million views. And if you look at the comments, people are like, yay, Candace. Oh, well said, well said, well said, well said. It's like, what? This is crazy. Now, let's analyze these points that she's saying about Black Africans being sold by other Black Africans. Let's analyze it. Let's take a look at this. Right? I want you guys to see something here. I want you to understand. So remember, she's saying that the Blacks were sold by own Black Africans for as little as rum and whatever. I want you guys to look at this map. You must remember that when the European came into Africa, as you can see, the first European that started to explore Africa was the Portuguese. You see the map on the left there. And you can see sort of the routes that they took and what they were trying to do. And you can see the dates next to it. It's in the 15th century, 1450, 1480, 1490. This is the first known, quote unquote, European, the Portuguese, who really started to make inroads into Africa. Okay, so remember that it's the 15th century, right? Now, if we go back to this slide, you'll see here that the Arabs had come in and conquered and dominated North and West Africa. You can see their movements and the dates and the times in which they dominated. And when they came into this territory, as you can see there, they brought the Arab slave trade. In earlier slides, I discussed the Arab slave trade earlier on, and we saw the comparison differences between the Arab, European, and the indigenous African servitude. And you can see here that by the time the Europeans come in the 1400, Africa, the whole of North and pretty much most of West Africa is dominated by the Arabs coming in, conquering the Africans, enslaving them, turning their women into concubines, and then cutting off the you know what of the men. Okay, this is general, but okay. And here you can see the Muslim Arab slave routes, right, that existed towards the end of the so-called Middle Ages. You can see that it's mostly in the north, a little bit in the east there, and all that. So, in other words, by the time the European came in, they there was already a slave trade that was happening for hundreds of years, instigated by the Arabs who invaded Africa. So the point that I'm making, you see the map on the right there, you can see that most of northern and western Africa was pretty much Islamic. Okay, they were not the entire, it was pretty much had converted to Islam, and not only converted to Islam, but had pretty much over many generations, the people there were pretty much a different people, right? Because remember what I told you, the Arabs came in, they had sex with the women, and then the men, a lot of them were castrated, or they were killed, and yes, there were some that converted to Islam in order to escape that. But generally speaking, you already have a slave trade, slave routes, and it was brought in by the Arabs. It was a very brutal form of slavery. Many people argue that in many ways it's just as brutal as the transatlantic. So by the time the European came into Africa, they already came in where the trading of slaves was already happening, instigated and started by the Arabs, the non-indigenous people of this land. So that's a very important point, because when she says black Africans sold other black Africans, it's you have to look at the Arab influence. Okay, and I showed you the slave routes that were already there. Then she made another statement that the Africans, the Europeans didn't go in and conquer and kidnap and all that. They waited on the coast for their Arab partners in order to bring the slaves to them. Come on, guys. Do you believe that? Remember, the transatlantic slave trade, okay, now by the time the British got into it, it had really taken on a whole new, there was a great need for labor, human labor, right? You think that these capitalists, or whatever you want to call them, would just be waiting at the coast and hoping that they get all their slaves from there? Think of it logically. No, they would try to go in. Now, at this time, it wasn't easy for them to penetrate Africa. So this is one of the reasons why they had to have these partners, these sellouts who would do it. They were selling slaves anyway. And a lot of times, just because these people are black doesn't mean that they're family. The whole concept of black people, that before the 16th century, during this time that we're talking about here, people were not calling themselves black. You were called according to your specific family group. Here you see on the map on the right, you have the Bantus, the Zulus, the Khoikhoi, the etc., etc., etc. This is how people were known. And if one conquered another, or one had a war with each other, those people, just because they're black, doesn't mean that they're the same people. So for Candace to say, or PragerU to say that your own people sold into slavery is a bull-faced lie. Because a lot of times the people who were being sold into slave were enemies of a particular group of people. I mean, you can just see that logically. People are not going to enslave their own brothers and sisters and their own people. They're not going to do it. No, nobody's going to do that. But they will enslave the next door neighbor who we just had a war with. And like I said, the people, they didn't even call themselves Africans. It wasn't based on that. They used to, there's war. They used to fight each other. You understand what I'm saying? So it's just like Europe. I mean, Europe now, people think of Europe, particularly Western Europe, as white people, but there are different groups of people there. The British and the French had 100 years war against each other. And a lot of people, even believe that The British and the French have not even gotten over that. Even today, there's still that little bit of thing there. The Irish, the Italians, a lot of these people, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, they were dominated by the British for many centuries. But you wouldn't say that their own people enslaved you. No, the Welsh are different from the Irish, the Scots different from the Italian. They're different people, different heritage, different cultures. Well, the same thing in Africa. And this whole idea that African people, as Candace says, which is sort of this passive group that no, African people, many African people resisted the European or the transatlantic slave trade, and even the slave trade that was occurring in Arabs. Now, there's a movie on Netflix, you guys can see that there's a movie here on Netflix. Let's listen to this.
Into an era of darkness, a warrior, a queen destined to lead.
There are no slaves in my kingdom.
She fearlessly defended her king.
It's called The Queen. She fearlessly defended her kingdom.
Power.
The king's under threat. The king is always under threat.
Africans were not passive, just sitting there and allowing this thing to happen. They resisted. Many Africans did. So this business about our own ancestors sold us enslaved, they didn't give a damn about us. It just drives me crazy. You can go on Netflix. It's called Queens or something like that. And this is Queen Nzinga, right? And you can just Google her and see. This is an example of a Black African resisting this slavery that was happening and fighting against who? Europeans who were coming into her territory or in territories near her and trying to capture Black people, and she was fighting against those people. So Candace, it's clear then that the Europeans were actually not just waiting out in the boats by the water waiting for the slaves to come. They also raided and went in and kidnapped, and there's lots of evidence about that. So that's another bull-faced lie, in my opinion. Now, let's go to the last thing of what she's saying here.
Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest.
And again, it's focusing on Africa. This is a Black woman saying this. Now listen to what she's going to say.
Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not.
Where it originated. It didn't originate there, okay? It originated in Europe. They're the ones who had the ideas and put the transatlantic slave trade together. Black people, it didn't originate in sub-Saharan. Black people and say, hey, you know what? We're going to give some Europeans some slaves. We got to come up with this transatlantic slave system. No, it originated in Europe, in the minds of white people.
Not being
not
purchased
all white people.
by any country of white men. In
Just
fact,
the bad
slavery,
ones.
by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like...
Okay, and here's the thing with that. She says it's happening exclusively in non-white countries. Again, to say that, you see, the white people have gotten rid of it. They're not doing it. It's you Black people who are still doing it. Well, where is slavery today? I can think of two places, Sudan and Mauritania, right? What are those two countries? They are pretty much Muslim countries. And guess what? You know who's doing the enslaving in those countries? The Arabs, the Arab descent, the Arab speaking, the Arab, the Muslim. And you know who's enslaved? The Christian, the Black indigenous people. The darker skinned people are the ones who are enslaved. And the Arabs are the ones who are enslaving in both those countries. That's who the makeup of the slave is. So you still have indigenous Blacks who are being enslaved. Okay, how about that, Candace? That is the common denominator in all this stuff, right? That the darker skinned, black, indigenous population continue to be oppressed by whites, by Arabs, you know. She mentions here child soldiers, human trafficking. Human trafficking is a form of slavery as far as I'm concerned, okay? Human trafficking, I mean, that is the definition of slavery, right? So human trafficking is not something that is not in, it's in every country, and I would argue it's mostly in white countries, and certainly the customers for those human traffickers are in white countries or Western countries. But she made the point to say, oh, but slavery by the traditional definition, okay, to protect herself there, even though before that she already talked about human trafficking and child soldiers and everything, and saying, now all this stuff is happening in Africa. Human trafficking is happening all over the world, by the way. Okay, and that is a form of slavery. Okay, so don't just pick out Africa. And even when you do pick out Africa, know who you're talking about and who is enslaved and who's doing the enslaving.
Like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago.
Until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. My God. This woman, man. This is why she married, no offense, this is why she married a white man. You know, she's, you know, I'm sure she thinks she has she married one of those good white people. You know, it's like, this is a complete, this is it, man. This is Candace going completely off the rail, you know, and I'm sorry.
Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American
Candace, Black Americans don't need anybody else to tell them that there's racism and the extent of the racism, right? Black people can do that very well on their own. They don't need the Democratic Party or whoever else telling them or propaganding them about racism. Black people can figure that out on their own, and they know what's up because they're the ones experiencing the the the, the racism. They're experiencing it. Okay, they don't need someone else to tell them. And again, it's just the whole thing about these black people are just so dumb that oh, what's happening, massa? Oh, there's racism, massa. Okay, massa. Damn, man, there's racism. Okay, black people know already, right? We don't need the left or the Democratic Party telling us that there's racism or that there's white supremacy or whatever.
American dream? If we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candace Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
Okay, so it is Prager University. Ah, Candace, man, this is a real disappointment. Now, I want to end this by looking at a couple of things. Okay, so this is what I come up with. The truth is that the indigenous blacks were conquered, captured, kidnapped, and by white European slave traders and Arab Muslim slave traders. Arab Muslim slave traders and indigenous black sellouts sold indigenous blacks to the white European slave traders. Modern slavery, yes, it's a worldwide issue. It affects millions across continents. It's not confined to non-white countries. Okay, as I said, there are different forms and different types of slavery, you know, and anything forced or against the person's will is basically considered slavery. Okay, and I think we have to put human trafficking in there. I know, it doesn't seem like that. It's like slavery. Somehow we're separating slavery from human trafficking. But what is slavery? It's human trafficking. Buying, selling, shipping humans. Okay. However, this should not take away or diminish the historical significance and the lasting effects, okay, of the transatlantic slave trade on African and African descended communities. Okay, so that's one thing that I think has to come out. Okay, And recognizing the existence of modern slavery should complement, it shouldn't compete with the need to address this historical legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and the American slavery, okay, and its impacts. Okay, both the historical and the contemporary, okay, forms of slavery highlight this broader issue of human rights, and we have to understand this. It's very, very important. Finally, we have to acknowledge the importance of the victim's perspective, okay, because this is very much a piece on the perpetrator's perspective, right, and defending the perpetrator and saying that the perpetrator, hey, I'm not taking into consideration what I've done as the perpetrator. I'm just going to create a piece, this propaganda piece that says, oh, well, everybody else was doing it. And even your own people sold you, and they sold you for nothing. They had no value. We didn't go in and raid. It came to us. Doesn't that sound like trying to justify and also tone down what you did, detract from what you did? It sounds exactly like that to me. And that was the purpose of this video. Okay. We have to recognize, right here on the screen, it says black victimhood is nothing. Okay. What else did she say? Let me see
Is
what she said
nothing
here.
if not profitable.
If not profitable. How can black victimhood be profitable? Right? Well, I guess she explained it. She says, oh, it's bringing in cash. It's not profitable to black people. It's not profitable to black people. Okay? So it must only be profitable to the dominant society. So recognizing the suffering and resilience of African Americans throughout history is not about perpetuating victimhood. Okay? It is about seeking justice. It is about understanding. It is about reconciliation. It's also about honoring their contributions to the society, to American society, and acknowledging, yes, the systemic barriers they have faced and continue to face. So the narrative of victimhood, I always get upset when people talk about this thing. Oh, are you a victim? You're dwelling in victimhood. The narrative of victimhood, okay, when framed respectfully and accurately, it can highlight the need for societal change and the importance of addressing the roots of inequality. If we don't talk about it and we sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist, it's just going to continue to perpetuate. And that's what's been happening in the United States of America. It has to be addressed. And just because black people are pointing it out and looking at the historical injustices that have been done to black people, and I would argue continue to be done today, doesn't mean we are dwelling in victimhood. We are seeking justice, restitution, reparation. We are trying to understand it so that we can understand ourselves today. And furthermore, we can plot a future based on that new understanding so that we can thrive in the future and our children and their children thrive and not have to go through this thing that black people somehow always seem to be going through. Okay, I'm starting to preach right now. Highlighting the experiences of African Americans both during slavery and its aftermath is essential for an honest reckoning with America's history. While concerns about exploitation are valid, they should not overshadow the imperative to address and remedy the injustices that continue to affect African American or Black American communities. Acknowledging victimization in this context is about seeking truth, as I said, fostering healing, and not exploiting suffering or political or financial gain. That's it right there. Leave your comments, continue to like, subscribe, and everything like that. I'll be back as soon as I can with some more content. And until then, be good, be safe. Hope everyone is doing well. And I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.